Section 41 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M. P. Hill. Section 41, Freemasonry. Objection. Why is the Church opposed to Freemasonry without any distinction? Whatever may be the aims of Masonry on the continent of Europe, there is certainly nothing hostile to the Catholic Church or to religion generally in Anglo-American Masonry, whose object is mutual aid among the members of the fraternity and the promotion of the spirit of brotherhood throughout the world. The answer. The Catholic Church is opposed to Freemasonry because there is a solidarity between Masons of all countries. Freemasonry is international in the sense that there is a mutual recognition of Masons among themselves as belonging to one general fraternity, that there is a systematic maintenance of correspondence between the Masonic lodges, that the Masons of the world meet in international convention, that they have a common literature and common signs, passwords, and symbols. But what is more to the point is that Anglo-American Masonry has long since been either absorbed or dominated by Masonry of the Scottish type, which is essentially naturalistic and anti-Christian, has a religion of its own, and is, in general, one of the worst forms of Freemasonry. This solidarity is openly acknowledged by leading Masonic authorities. Brother Pike, for instance, who is an American oracle of Freemasonry, writes Official Bulletin, 1885, Volume 7, 29, when the journal in London, which speaks of the Freemasonry of the Grand Lodge of England, depreciatingly protested that the English Freemasonry was innocent of the charges preferred by the Papal Bull, Encyclical 1884, against Freemasonry, when it declared that English Freemasonry had no opinions, political or religious, and that it did not in the least degree sympathize with the loose opinions and extravagant utterances of part of the continental Freemasonry, it was very justly and very conclusively checkmated by the Romish organs with the reply, "It is idle for you to protest. You are Freemasons, and you recognize them as Freemasons. You give them countenance, encouragement, and support, and you are jointly responsible with them, and cannot shirk that responsibility." Quoted by Gruber, Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 5, 9, page 778. What is said here of English Masonry would be generally regarded as applicable to American Masonry. Pike is only one of the many authorities that acknowledge the oneness of Freemasonry throughout the world. American Freemasonry was at first comparatively innocent, but the Scottish Rite, since its importation into the United States at the close of the American Revolution, has gradually made its way to supremacy. Its hostility to the papacy and to monarchy is acknowledged by Masonic writers. Its 30th degree is distinguished by its practice of trampling on the Pope's tiara and the royal crown. It professes a belief in the great architect of the world, but discards all received modes of worshipping him. It has, in fact, a religion of its own, a religion which is paraded as antedating all the religions now in vogue, the primitive religion practiced by Noe, and others long before the advent of Moses and the Mosaic Law. That Freemasonry has a religion of its own was rather strangely and surprisingly acknowledged in 1903 by the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of the state of New York. A certain Robert Kopp having been expelled from the fraternity, appealed against the action of his brethren to the civil courts of the state, and received an unfavorable judgment, first from the Supreme Court, and afterward from the appellate division of the same court. One of the strong points made by the Grand Lodge was that a Masonic society was a religious body, possessing all the privileges of any religious association. The following is an extract from the briefs and points presented by counsel for the Grand Lodge at the second trial. The right to membership in the Masonic fraternity is very much like the right to membership in a church. Each requires a candidate for admission to subscribe to certain articles of religious belief as an essential prerequisite to membership. Each requires a member to conduct himself thereafter in accordance with certain religious principles. Each requires its members to adhere to certain doctrines of belief and action. The precepts contained in the Landmarks and the Charges of a Freemason, see pages 92 to 100 of the Book of Constitutions, edition of 1900, formulate a creed so thoroughly religious in character that it may well be compared with the formally expressed doctrine of many a denominational church. The Masonic fraternity may, therefore, be quite properly regarded as a religious society, and the long line of decisions holding that a religious society shall have sole and exclusive jurisdiction to determine matters of membership should be deemed applicable to the Masonic fraternity. There is so much trumpery speculation on religious subjects in Masonic writings, so much is made of the meaning of arbitrary symbols, which only a few adepts are supposed to be capable of understanding. So strong is the tendency to go back to ancient superstitions, which to a great extent disappeared at the dawn of Christianity, that the plain man of sense is tempted to regard it all as moonshine or as the purest humbug. But whatever may be said of the sanity or of the sincerity of Masonic science, it is, after all, only one phase of a tendency so marked in our day to return to paganism in thought, sentiment, and action. The Masonic conception of the architect of the universe is anything but the Christian conception of God, and is distinctly pagan. And yet how many has it not deceived outside the ranks of the fraternity? Though, even within the order, as we shall see later, the interpretation of words, symbols, and allegories, given in the lower degrees, is part and parcel of a system of deception practiced on the initiated themselves. The following clear statement of Brother Pike is enough to show the attitude of Freemasonry toward Christianity and all other forms of religion. The italics are ours. Masonry, says Pike, propagates no creed except its own most simple and sublime one, taught by nature and reason. There has never been a false religion in the world. The permanent, one, universal religion is written in visible nature and explained by the reason, and is completed by the wise analogies of faith. Gruber, Ibid. In the Masonic view, no religion is false, because the rites and dogmas of all religions, Christianity included, are at least the symbols of the real truths of which Freemasonry is the fortunate, perhaps the sole, possessor. Christianity, Buddhism, Mohammedanism are but husks enclosing the precious kernel of Masonic truth. Surely there is enough in this to repel any Christian who has the smallest knowledge of his faith. If, therefore, any reader of this book should light upon a member of the craft who approaches him in that politely cautious way which is learned among the brethren, and assures him that there is nothing in English or American Masonry that ought to shock a Christian, he may set it down as certain, supposing the Mason's veracity, either that he, like Brother Pike, is speaking in some transcendental Masonic sense, or that his assurances are based on ignorance. He may not be enough of an adept to know what anyone may know by consulting the acknowledged authorities of the order. As likely as not, he belongs to the class of Blue Masons, or low-degree Masons, who pride themselves on initiation in some grand this or that, without knowing whither they are going to be led in their possible ascent toward the top. The blue degrees, says Pike, are but the outer court or portico of the temple. Part of the symbols are displayed there to the initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he shall understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine he understands them. Their true explication is reserved for the adepts, the princes of Masonry, quoted by Bruce in A Study in American Freemasonry. Masons, says Brother Oliver, may be 50 years masters of the chair, and yet not learn the secret of the brotherhood. Gruber, Ibid. It is for the adept, says Pike, to understand the meaning of the symbols. Ibid. And Oliver adds, brethren high in rank and office are often unacquainted with the elementary principles of the science. Ibid. It is a common pretense of Masons in their discourses on Masonic science that they are the successors of the ancient adepts in pagan mysteries. Such is Freemasonry in its attitude toward religion. Masons themselves acknowledge that the sympathies of Anglo-American Masonry go out to the anti-Catholic and anti-Christian revolutions of continental Europe. In countries like Great Britain and the United States, representative Masons may detest the Church as much as their European brethren, but either they cannot or dare not give expression to their detestation in overt acts of hostility, but they are in perfect sympathy with all the plots of Masonry in European countries against the freedom of the Church, against the religious orders, and against Catholic education. The aims and machinations of Freemasonry on the continent of Europe are well known, and no very extra pains seem to be taken to conceal them. Father Gruber, from whom we have been quoting and who is a master of the subject, furnishes an abundance of evidence from the bulletin in the Compte Rendu of the Grand Orient of France, showing the extent and character of Masonic anti-religious activities in France. It is clear from these sources that French Freemasonry aims at getting everyone and everything under its control. Que personne ne bougera plus en France, à deux de nous. I said in the Assembly of 1898, says Massey, one of its official orators, that it is the supreme duty of Freemasonry to interfere each day more and more in political and profane struggles. Success in the anti-clerical combat is in a large measure due to Freemasonry, for it is its spirit, its program, its methods that have triumphed. If the bloc has been established, this is owing to Freemasonry and to the discipline learned in the lodges. The measures we have now to urge are the separation of church and state, and a law concerning instruction. Let us put our trust in the word of our brother Combes. We need vigilance, and above all, mutual confidence, if we are to accomplish our work, as yet unfinished. The Republic must rid itself of the religious congregations, sweeping them off by a vigorous stroke. Even worse aims than these are manifested by Senator Delpech, President of the Grand Orient. The triumph of the Galilean, he tells his brethren, has lasted 20 centuries, but now he, footnote, we have reproduced the capitalization of the author, although contrary to the canons of good taste and general usage. End footnote. Dies in his turn. The mysterious voice announcing, to Julian the Apostate, the death of Pan, today announces the death of the impostor God, who promised an era of justice and peace to those who believed in him. The illusion has lasted a long time. The mendacious God is now disappearing in his turn. He passes away to join in the dust of ages the other divinities of India, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, who saw so many deceived creatures prostrate before their altars. Brother Masons, we rejoice to state that we are not without our share in this overthrow of the false prophets. The Romish Church, founded on the Galilean myth, began to decay rapidly from the very day on which the Masonic Association was established. Gruber, Ibid. The declarations of Italian Freemasonry are no less clear as to the aims of the Brotherhood. The Rivista Massoneria Italiana, an official organ of Italian Masonry, has repeated avowals of the ultimate intentions of the order. It tells us that the end it has set before it is the destruction of monarchy and of all thrones, and that the means to the end is the annihilation of the papacy and of all revealed religion. 1889, page 4, 1886, page 378. A thorough secularization of the state and of the schools, as well as the destruction of the Christian family and of all authority. Ibid. It informs us that all revealed religion is poison to the people. 1890, page 159. That all instruction in any kind of catechism in the schools should be prohibited. 1892, page 231. And that to the noble task of bringing all this about, Freemasons the world over are devoting their energies. 1892, page 222, 241. The platform of Freemasonry is clearly set forth in the Masonic publication entitled The Papal Church and Freemasonry, a Masonic answer to the Papal Encyclical, Leipzig. Its aims are these: the demolishing of all church authority, the entire separation of church and school, the abolishing of religious instruction, the de-Christianizing of family life, and the emancipation of woman. This is the sort of thing to which Anglo-American Masonry lends its sympathy. Freemasonry is one and united throughout the world, and everywhere it is under the same ecclesiastical ban. Catholics need hardly be told that for them membership in any Masonic organization means excommunication from the Church. Masonry, therefore, whether it be British or American or continental, is not simply an institution whose object is mutual aid and the establishment of a true brotherhood among men. Its purposes are deeper and more important than these. It aims at universal dominion. It aims at crushing out supernatural religion and paganizing what is left. Even the benevolent purposes it makes profession of are anything but benevolent as regards the higher interests both of individuals and of society. Mutual assistance among Masons is not confined to their helping one another to get on in the world. It has a wider sphere and extends to acts that involve a betrayal of honor and an infringement of duty. The claims of country in the hour of strife are little regarded by the Mason when opposed to the interests of a member of the craft. So at least the following promise of the 30th degree would seem to imply. I pledge myself never to harm a knight Kadosh, 30th degree, either by word or deed. I vow that if I find him as a foe in the battlefield, I will save his life when he makes me the sign of distress, and that I will free him from prison and confinement upon land or water. The inexorable laws of war themselves, says an official orator of the Grand Orient of France, quoted by Father Gruber, Ibid, had to bend before Freemasonry, which is perhaps the most striking proof of its power. A sign sufficed to stop the slaughter. The combatants threw away their arms, embraced each other fraternally, and at once became friends and brethren, as their oaths prescribed. The Royal Archmason swears, "I will assist a companion Royal Archmason when I see him engaged in any difficulty, and will espouse his cause so as to extricate him from the same, whether he be right or wrong." Gruber, Ibid. The fraternal spirit in Masonry is plainly that of a close corporation devoted to self at the expense of right and justice. Another aspect of Masonic brotherhood should make it contemptible to the initiated themselves. Have we not seen Masons confessing that those in the lower ranks are the dupes of those in the higher? That the secrets of this happy brotherhood are known only to a very few? Absolute obedience, solemnly sworn, and extending to every possible command, is not the condition of a brother making a covenant with brothers. It is the condition of a slave who has placed himself under the yoke of tyrannical masters. And yet Masons are proud to exhibit the badges of their servitude, as though these were the insignia of a privileged class of mortals. Privileged they certainly are in the opportunities afforded them for material gain and social advancement, advantages, however, which most men of honor would scorn to purchase by associating themselves with a narrow clique, ruled by a still narrower one at the top, to say nothing of the sacrifice involved to things that ought to be dearer to them than any temporal advantage whatsoever. See Secret Societies. End of section 41.
Section 42 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by John Michael, Sussex, Wisconsin, USA. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill, Section 42. Free Thought. A free-thinking reverie. A free thinker is the only one who knows what freedom means. He has burst the fetters of religious servitude, the most galling of all fetters, especially such as the Roman Church binds upon her subjects. The truth. There is a sort of superstition attaching to the use of the expression free thought. Is freedom the one thing necessary in thought? The great object of the mind's craving is truth. The possession of truth is the end and aim of all its activity. Freedom is but a condition for the exercise of its activity in the pursuit of truth. An aimless exercise of this activity is mental recklessness. On the other hand, the possession of truth, whether it be the result of free thinking or not, is the mind's one and only source of contentment. There is a healthy freedom of thought, but it can never be identified with that freedom which deliberately sets to work to change the conditions which nature and truth have set for the acquisition of knowledge. Truth is not a thing that starts into existence at our bidding. It is not dependent on us. Rather, we are dependent on it. Our declarations of independence do not extend to the realms of truth. There we are subjects, not sovereigns. This is the first lesson impressed upon us, without our knowing it, when reason begins to dawn. The youth must learn, and not kick at the goads by way of asserting his freedom of thought. Imagine a schoolboy refusing to submit his mind to the truths of a multiplication table. And yet, A similar independence in mature minds is sometimes considered wisdom. The truths of the multiplication table, though simply worded, are absolute and eternal truths. But may there not be other truths equally absolute and eternal? Truths bearing on our origin, our destiny, our relations to the Supreme Being? And may there not be a means of getting to those truths? Is there not a presumption in their favor? Nay, more than a presumption, when so many of the world's greatest minds have admitted them. It is notorious that nearly all freethinkers begin their thinking with the assumption that all these truths are myths, or that if they are more than myths, there is no way of reaching them. Thus, they actually restrict their freedom and throw away a clue to the discovery of truth. They may be likened to a man who makes a long and fruitless search for an object he has mislaid, and all because he has too lightly assumed that there is no use in searching for it in a certain place, the very place where it happens to be. And yet, the truths thus lightly set aside are of tremendous importance, bearing as they do upon eternity. True freedom of thought begets an open-mindedness that excludes from its consideration no possible source of truth. It furthermore makes an effort, as a leading apologist remarks, to remove from the mind all influences that do not make for genuine knowledge, either because they are not fact, or have no basis in fact, or because they are mere imaginings, or habitual but erroneous impressions, or false or superficial interpretations of the perceptions of sense, or of other sources of information. If by freedom of thought is meant a freedom from assumptions and preconceived ideas, it is one of the conditions for arriving at the truth. The precise opposite of this healthy freedom of thought is the besetting sin of most of the anti-Christian scientists of the day. Materialism, especially that of the Haeckelian stamp, deliberately shuts out one possible source of truth by assuming that nothing exists but what can be perceived by the senses, that all things are either matter or energy, and that energy is only a quality of matter. What possible grounds can be alleged for such an assumption? Neither observation nor experiment can furnish any foundation for it. Must we conclude that the wish is father to the thought? No one can read the works of the free-thinking Heckle and not notice, on the one hand, what a tissue of reckless assumptions they are, and on the other, with what relentless hatred the author assails the notion of a soul, a God, a hereafter, without perceiving that he is a hater of religion first and a scientist after. End of section 42.
Section 43 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Tony Duchepek. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill. God's Existence. An atheistic jibe. Theism, a belief in a personal God, would have us divide the world into earth and sky. Men run about the earth, and God is seated in the skies, whence he rules the earth. But astronomy steps in and removes the sky, and with it, the God who dwells in it. Astronomy has pushed the limits of the universe so far as to leave no room for a God. Schopenhauer. The answer. Schopenhauer has not said the last word on the subject. God is not the subject matter of astronomy or of any other physical science. It is not by the telescope that God is discovered, but by an instrument of a different order. The human mind, by means of reflection, can penetrate beyond the stars and discover the ultimate cause of all things. In maintaining the existence of God, we must remind the atheist of our day that we are not holding a brief for the existence of some obscure being whose worshippers are of yesterday, and whose worship is being obtruded upon the intelligence of the world. A belief in God is the earliest and most constant fact in human history. Moreover, a belief in God has laid hold of countless intellects of the highest order. And yet, today, the shallowest of minds brush it aside, as though it were one of those empty hypotheses that rise and disappear in a generation. Ah, but remember, says the atheist, those highly intellectual believers of the past weigh little in the balance today. They were ignorant of the science of our day, which is fatal to the doctrine of a personal God. But not so fast. A glance at another article in this work, Science and Faith, will reveal the fact that most of the great leaders of science in the 19th century were believers in a personal God. Science and atheism have indeed met in the same mind, but in our own age, considering the influences at work producing atheism and agnosticism, the fact that a man of science is without faith is neither more nor less surprising than that a merchant or a lawyer or an artist should be an unbeliever. The fact proves nothing as regards the necessary bearing of science on religion. The neglect of practical religion, lack of instruction, the dominion of passion over reason and grace, any of these facts in a man's life may account for his lapsing into atheism. The kind of science for which the present generation is mostly distinguished is that of the experimental sort. But what has experimental science produced that tells against the existence of a personal God? Experiment can never land us in a knowledge of ultimate causes. As soon as it reaches the outer confines of experience, it must hand over the work of investigation to rational philosophy. And who is not aware of the chaos that reigns in the philosophy of the day? Geological science has thrown some light upon the history of our globe, but it knows nothing of what went before. History and archaeology, in the hands of the atheist, have been wielded against a belief in God, and an attempt has been made to bring the infinite and eternal God down to the level of the national and tribal gods of the Gentiles. But the result has been to throw into greater relief the immense contrast between the one invisible and omnipotent God of the chosen people and the countless anthropomorphic figments of the pagan mind. The fact that so spiritual a conception of deity was carried down through the long ages of its history by a people surrounded on all sides by carnal-minded idolaters is itself no small proof of the existence of a God whose providence is the key to this historical anomaly. As to astronomical science, it has only exhibited a wider domain of creative power than was known to the ancients. God's world is larger than we had thought, but astronomy has not proved that he does not still hold it in the hollow of his hand. In a word, there is no science or other branch of knowledge that lends any support to the denial of a personal God. Atheism is generated either in minds that have never seriously and patiently examined into the evidence of God's existence, or in minds that have been warped by moral delinquency. Superficiality and narrowness of outlook are the dominant qualities of much philosophizing on the subject. The shallowness that begets atheism was well discerned by one of the wisest of modern minds. A little philosophy, says Bacon, inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion. For while the mind of man looketh upon second causes scattered, it may sometimes rest in them, and go no further. But when it beholdeth the chain of them confederate and linked together, it must needs fly to providence and deity. Essays, Atheism. We shall now proceed to unfold some of the arguments by which human reason has demonstrated the existence of a supreme being. As we are not writing a treatise, the argumentation cannot be exhaustive, but it will serve to show how by reason and reflection the invisible things of him, as St. Paul expresses it, are clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood by the things that are made. Proofs of God's existence. The universe must have had a beginning. Therefore, it must have got its beginning from a being who himself had no beginning. Let us endeavor to bring out the force of this reasoning. First, as regards the material universe, things have come to their present condition by a series of changes. These changes are still observable on the largest scale. We see them in the processes of growth and decay. We notice too that one thing produces another, and that other a third. And there is evidence that such has been the case for ages. Hence, a series, or rather many series of causes and effects coming down from a remote past. Now my reason tells me that such a chain of causation must have had a beginning. Such a series of causes and effects without a beginning is inconceivable. There must have been one first cause, and therefore one not caused by another, but subsisting in and through itself. Let us throw a little light upon this conclusion by an illustration. My eyes are at this moment resting upon an oak tree. Let us designate it by the letter A. Now A is the offspring of another oak, B, which in turn owes its origin to C, and so on, back to D, E, and the rest. Is the series infinite, that is to say, endless? Or is it composed of a finite number, one that can be counted? We assert that it cannot be infinite. It must have had a beginning. And our reasons for the assertion are these. Number 1. If it were infinite, the series would never have come down to A. Let us prove this. Let us go back to E, familiar to the eyes of our great-great-grandfathers. Was the series infinite when it reached E? There is as much or as little reason for saying that it was infinite then as for saying that it is infinite now. But if infinite then, not a single oak could have been added to it, for an infinite number cannot receive any addition, and therefore E could not have propagated its kind. And we should not now be contemplating A, which nevertheless stands before us in all its beauty. Therefore, the series was not infinite. There must have been a first oak, unproduced by any other. Number 2. Again, if the series were infinite, A would be the last of its race, and hence, by the way, would be an object of the greatest curiosity. But what an absurdity to suppose that an acorn falling from A might not produce a tree of the same species. The series of oaks was, therefore, not endless, and there was one tree that began the series. The reader will remember that we are dealing with a genealogy of oaks only as an illustration of a principle. And the principle is that no chain of causes and effects is possible unless there be a first cause, one unproduced by another. But if this principle is once fairly established, the conclusion is irresistible that if we trace the numerous series of causes and effects that have made the world what it is today back to the beginning, we must arrive at a first cause, which has not been produced by another. And now, having arrived at the first cause of things, we must evolve the idea of a first cause and exhibit what is logically contained in it. We shall see ultimately that the first cause is identical with the sovereign God, whose existence it is our purpose to prove. The first cause was not produced by another. How then are we to account for its existence? Did it produce itself? Or did it start out of nothingness of itself? Both questions are too absurd to be considered. If therefore the first cause was not produced either by itself or by anything else, we must conclude that it was not produced at all. Its existence is due to no manner of causation whatever, and hence we are forced to the further conclusion that it must have its reason for existing in its very nature. Its nature requires it to exist. But if its nature requires it to exist, it cannot be conceived as non-existent. In other words, it is eternal. This, by the way, is an answer to Darwin's feeble question: whence came the first cause, and how did it arise? And now a few further deductions. The first cause, as we have seen, exists by a necessity of its nature. But if a thing exists at all, it must have some determinate form or mode of existence. A thing does not exist in general, but as this or that in particular, and with a definite nature and definite attributes. Hence, when we ascribe essential and necessary existence to a being, we ascribe it to that being such as it is, and as having a certain nature and certain attributes. Hence, its nature and attributes, or all that it is, and whatever it is, partake of the same necessity as its existence. Therefore, such a being is immutable, for any change would make it different from what it necessarily and essentially is. Later on, we shall see other reasons why any change, whether in essentials or in accidentals, is impossible. At every step, we are getting a better glimpse of the wonderful ideas which are wrapped up in the one idea of the first cause. There are more to come. The next deduction is the most important of all. It is that the first cause must possess unlimited being or unlimited perfection. It must be infinite. We shall not rehearse here the more abstruse metaphysical proofs of this thesis. A few simpler considerations will suffice to show that the first cause is infinitely perfect. First, the very fact that it is a self-existent being is proof sufficient. What higher perfection is conceivable than that the very nature of a thing requires it to exist? Or to put it somewhat differently, what higher grade of existence can we conceive than that in virtue of which a thing possesses its being of itself from eternity? Among created beings, we admire a person who is in some degree independent of outside influences in the development of some personal perfection. When, for instance, he adds to his knowledge by thinking out for himself the solution of the most intricate problems. And the higher the perfection evolved, the greater our admiration. What then shall we say of that being which has, by a necessity of its nature, not any mere power of self-development, but that which, in any case, is the basis and groundwork of all actual perfection, even the highest, vis-a-vis actual being or existence. Any specific perfection, finite or infinite in any being, supposes the existence of that being, and hence existence or actual being must be the basis and condition of any perfection, even though it be infinite. Therefore, self-existence must itself be an infinite perfection. But no infinite perfection can exist in a finite being. Therefore, the first cause is infinite. In the second place, we can deduce the infinite perfection of the first cause from the nature of the act by which it brings things into existence. The first cause simply creates or produces things out of nothing. This may be argued from the very fact that it is the first cause, but the deduction will be made clearer at a later stage of the discussion. Now, any single act of creation is a proof of infinite power. For by infinite power, we mean power so great that no finite thing, no matter how perfect, and no degree of perfection in a thing are beyond its range. But the first cause confers upon the thing created its very being, and to create the very being of a thing argues greater power than to create any specific perfection in it. For the perfections or attributes of a thing are but modes of its being. Hence, no conceivable perfection in a thing exceeds the creative power of the first cause, and therefore its power is unlimited. Furthermore, if we limit the creative power of the first cause, we imply that some things are too great to be included within its range. But a little reflection will show that in this connection, greater and less are virtually one thing. No greater exercise of power is involved in the creation of greater things than in the creation of lesser. As to create is to produce out of nothing. There is no process to be gone through. There is no existing matter to work upon, and hence, creating is simply willing. Let there be light, and light was made. And consequently, so far as the creating agent is concerned, it is as easy to will a universe as to will a grain of sand. And on the side of the object to be created, the task of creating cannot be greater in one case than in another, as all things created are simply drawn from nothing, and are thus reduced to the same level. Therefore, there can be nothing so great or so perfect as to be beyond the creative power of the first cause. Therefore, its power is limitless or infinite. And here again, we can argue from an infinite attribute to an infinitude of being or of perfection. In the process we have been following thus far, we have traced all the series of changes that have taken place in the universe to their beginning and have arrived at the first cause in which all things have their origin. Now there is a class of atheists, certain materialists, who admit that there must have been a beginning of all change, but who are pleased to find the ultimate cause of all change in matter. They assume without proof that material substance existed from all eternity, uncaused and self-subsisting, needing no God to have created or preserved it or unfolded its energies, and having in itself the germ of all its future activities. But it will not be difficult to show that self-subsisting and self-evolving matter is an impossibility. First, it is impossible that matter could have evolved its own energies. For primeval self-existing matter must originally have been either in a state of rest or in a state of motion. If in a state of motion, there must have been a beginning of the motion. For motion from eternity involves all the absurdities included in the notion of an infinite series of causes and effects. Hence, our supposed primeval matter must have been originally in a quiescent state. Let us realize what this implies. Imagine a particle of primitive matter suspended in space, quiet, but capable of motion. What will set it in motion? The law of inertia is there to forbid it to move a fraction of an inch unless acted upon by some outside force. Primeval matter would therefore stand in need of some external cause of motion. And what we say of local motion is true of every form of activity and of every exertion of energy. It must have a beginning, and the beginning must originate from without. For in the first place, no exertion of energy in matter is possible without some local motion. But the local motion cannot be spontaneous, for the law of inertia forbids it. In the second place, and apart from the law of inertia, there is nothing in the attributes of matter that could enable it to exert its energies. Imagine a particle of quiescent matter a moment before its first display of energy. What can possibly determine it to act in the next moment rather than 5 minutes, or for that matter, 5 centuries later? Is it in the power of matter to choose the moment of its awakening from its eternal slumber? It would be puerile to suppose that matter was predetermined to act in some such way as the hammer of an alarm clock is predetermined to act by the winding and setting of the clock. In the case of the alarm clock, the alarm bell displays its energy at a certain moment, but its action supposes a continuous mechanical movement preceding and leading up to it, and even that would be impossible without the action of the human hand that wound up the clock. There is nothing in matter that can give the first impulse to its activities. The impulse must be imparted by one in whom mind and will make him independent of time, or to put it more accurately, enable him to make a beginning of time by setting things in motion. Matter, therefore, depends for its activity upon a sovereign artificer. But does it depend upon him also for its existence? May not matter have had an eternal and independent existence of its own? We answer no, because self-existence would be incompatible with its nature and its attributes. Self-existent matter must have had some determinate state or condition of existence. To begin with, it must have been either in a state of rest or in a state of motion. But we know that of itself, matter cannot determine its existing in either state. It is indifferent to either and must be set in motion or be brought to a state of rest by outside influences. But as it must be in either of the two states, and yet cannot of itself be in either, it cannot exist at all unless existence be given it by some external cause. It requires, in a word, to be created, and thus the first cause appears under the aspect of a creator. And what is true of rest and motion is true of other conditions of matter. Matter must be either in a solid or in a liquid or in a gaseous state. It must also be in a definite place. But matter is of itself indifferent to all these conditions taken severally, though by external causes it may be made to pass from one condition to another. Therefore, as self-existence would argue, self-determination as regards these conditions, matter cannot be self-existent and must have been created. In the second place, if matter were self-existent, it would be incapable of change. And yet we know it to be changeable from one form or condition to another. It must now be evident that the first cause possesses the nature and the attributes which we ascribe to God. It, or rather He, is self-existent and eternal. He is infinitely perfect and is therefore infinitely powerful and infinitely wise or intelligent, though His infinite wisdom and power may be deduced also from the creative act. He is the creator of the visible universe and is therefore its sovereign Lord and Master. That there can be only one such being is evident from the fact that He is infinite. The infinite must comprehend all being, and hence there can be but one who is infinite. In saying, however, that the infinite embraces all being, we must distinguish between two senses in which the proposition may be taken. To use the language of theologians, God contains all things in Himself, either formally, that is to say, as things are in themselves, or eminently, that is, in some higher or more excellent sense. Formally, He possesses all His own essential and infinite attributes. Eminently, He possesses the perfections belonging to created beings. If those perfections are of the spiritual order, He possesses them in an infinite degree and in a way that makes them one with His divine essence, which is not true of created things. Goodness, wisdom, and power, which may belong to created things, are possessed by God in an infinite degree and without any admixture of imperfection. The qualities of matter He cannot possess formally, as that would argue limitation and imperfection. But even these qualities, as well as all other attributes of finite things, may be said to be in God eminently, inasmuch as the eternal exemplars of things are conceived by the divine intelligence, and His omnipotence enables Him to bring them into existence. There is only one God, therefore, and only one Creator, and consequently only one source of finite being, whether of the spiritual or of the material order. But the argument from causation is not the only one by which God's existence is proved. The argument from design, as it is generally termed, is no less cogent. It is based on the order and beauty of the universe. Order, especially on a large scale, cannot be a result of chance, nor can it be produced by a blind and purposeless combination of forces. Order supposes a mind at work, and a mind working according to plan. Now, the presence of order in the world is easily observed. It is noticed, for instance, that many things work together for a common end, as for example, in the orderly recurrence of the seasons, a fact that includes so many interesting phenomena connected with the preservation of animal and vegetable life. Everywhere we see in things the purposes for which they were made. A study of the human body, for instance, reveals a wonderful adaptation of means to ends. Every organ being most aptly designed to serve a distinctive purpose of its own. The human eye alone furnishes overwhelming evidence of the presence of design. But a design supposes a designer. And here too we find that the great designer is not merely an artist working in materials ready to his hand. He gives things their very natures and all their properties. For in all the operations of nature that furnish evidence of design, there is a dependence on the natural properties of things, and the natural properties of things must be rooted in their natures. It is indeed by reason of the natural essences and qualities of things, that nature works out her grand exhibitions of design. It is because the natures of things conspire so perfectly and so intimately with the general plan that they must be pronounced to have the same origin as the plan itself. The origin of all things and of their attributes must therefore be the first great cause, whom we call God. So much, and indeed much more, which our limited space must exclude, does our reason tell us about the existence and the attributes of the Supreme Being. But reason is not our only teacher. God Himself has deigned to teach us by direct revelation. He has made Himself known to man from the very beginning, and the history of His revelation, carefully preserved, contains within itself its own credentials. The long but consistent narrative of the career of the chosen people given in the Bible, a people marvelously preserved in their purity of belief and worship amidst pagan surroundings, till led finally to the fullness of revelation in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, possesses an irresistible power of conviction to those who will take the pains to read it and ponder it in its entirety and compare it with any other history, sacred or profane. Promises fulfilled at the appointed time, this is the prevailing note heard in every part of the grand symphony, which finally reaches its climax in the wonderful life of the God-man. The life of Jesus, taken in its entire compass, and properly related to all that had gone before it, and to all that has happened since, has thus become the key to the world's history, and has confirmed in the minds of untold millions their faith in the existence of the infinite and eternal God. End of section 43. God's Existence. Recording by Tony Duchepek. Section 44 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Tony Duchepek. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hillt, Section 44. Objection. Good works are not necessary for salvation, for St. Paul says, "We account a man to be justified by faith alone, without the works of the law." The answer. This is not what St. Paul said, but what Luther represented him as saying in his German translation of the Bible. For in the original text the word alone is not found. The word was introduced to give support to Luther's new doctrine on justification. Besides, St. Paul is here speaking not of the good works of the Christian religion, but of the ceremonial observances of the Jewish law, the various forms of purification, bloody sacrifices, and the like. Objection. But man is perverted and sinful, and therefore can perform no genuine good works. Answer. Man can perform no good works, at least works availing to salvation without Christ. But with Christ he can. For in the Gospel of St. John we are told by Christ himself, "I am the vine, you are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same beareth much fruit." End of section 44, Good Works. Recording by Tony Duchepek.
Section 45 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla, Columbus, Ohio. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hillt. Section 45. Grace. Objection. Catholics are forever speaking of the necessity of grace. Without grace, I can do nothing, is the common formula, and yet I can do many a good deed without feeling the need of God's help. The answer. The Catholic teaching on the subject is that without divine grace, I can do nothing that avails to salvation. That is to say that although I can do many things that are good without grace, I cannot do that kind of good that merits heaven. The kingdom of heaven, as Christ teaches, is promised as the reward of our labor in this life. See the parable of the workers in the vineyard, Matthew chapter 20. Heaven must be fixed as the goal of our present existence. We must so live in this life as to be entitled to possess God in the next. The end set before me is a supernatural one. The faith by which I apprehend it is supernatural, as my natural powers could never have brought me to knowledge of it, and hence the need of grace. And the faith planted in the soul by grace is made a living faith by the further action of grace, and produces the ripe fruits of hope and charity. The giving of an alms by an unbeliever is a good work of the purely natural order, and God may deign to reward it, but it has no merit as far as heaven is concerned. The motive is not supernatural, nor is it the fruit of supernatural faith. It is God's will that I should live by faith. The just man liveth by faith. Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. Without faith it is impossible to please God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. There is a good deal of truth in the assertion that Catholics are forever speaking of the necessity of grace, and would that non-Catholics knew more of its necessity and felt more of its power. Grace would then be the solution of many problems which today are not even half solved. Divorce, with remarriage after divorce, is not even a half solution of the problem how to secure a happy union in wedlock, for it brings worse evils than it is designed to prevent, whereas the sacramental grace of a truly Christian marriage works miracles of harmonization between otherwise discordant hearts in the married state. The grace of the sacraments has vastly helped us in the solution of the problem regarding the formation of the Christian character in the souls of the young. Catholics cannot say too much about the need and power of divine grace. The consequences of the ignoring of grace are almost too evident. End of section 45.
Section 46 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill. Section 46. Heckle. On the tripod. The development of the individual life from the embryo form is but a representation in little of the development of the entire species from a primitive form. This is that irrefragable law which is the heaviest piece of artillery made to do battle for the truth. Under its repeated assaults, the magnificent fabric of the Roman hierarchy will tumble like a house of cards. Heckle. The truth about Heckle. Possibly some of our readers will ask who or what is Heckle. Others will doubtless have heard of him as a German professor of some notoriety, whose books have had no little vogue in English-speaking countries. Some few years ago, a cheap edition of one of Haeckel's books, entitled Welträtsel, English title The Riddle of the Universe, sold by the 100,000 in England, and many an unknowing reader had the pleasure of tasting a sample of what he was told was German science, the genuine article from the workshop of the best producer of the commodity to be found in all Germany. Haeckel, it must be admitted, has done some very meritorious work in his own special department of natural history, but for many years he has been impelled by an irresistible impulse to step out of his own legitimate province and play the role of philosopher. This has been the mistake of his life, for not only has he disgraced himself in the field of higher speculation, but even among his brother scientists, by reason of his charlatan spirit and his daring frauds, recently confessed by himself, he has covered himself with well-deserved obloquy. In his Welträtsel, he attempts to solve what he calls the riddle of the universe, that is to say, to account for the world as we find it, and trace all things back to their origin and to their ultimate elements. His philosophy is materialistic. All things consist of matter, and all have been evolved out of primitive forms of matter by virtue of a certain energy, which is an inherent quality of matter. The spiritual, in any right sense of the word, has no place in the system, God, soul, immortality are all relegated to the region of myths. The style in which the subject is treated by this would-be philosopher is of the quietly oracular kind. His treatise, so to style it, is a continuous stream of placidly self-confident assertion. He argues or discusses as little as a prophet. Viewed under another aspect, the book is an undignified appeal to the crowd. We may confidently assert that any other man of science who had a reputation to make or unmake would resent the imputation of being considered its author. For our part, we should never have mentioned his name in these pages, had not the powers of darkness made use of his reputation as a German scientist to poison the minds of thousands of unwary readers in English-speaking countries. Some lines above, we alluded to certain frauds associated with the name of Ernst Haeckel. They belong to the category of deadly sins, which are never forgiven the man of science. They consisted in a deliberate misrepresentation of facts. The ordinary student depends on the original investigator for a knowledge of facts, and facts are the very basis of all physical science. Hence a professor who knowingly distorts the facts presented to his pupils saps the foundation of science. This in a flagrant form is the offence of Ernst Haeckel. The circumstances were as follows. Haeckel is a Darwinist of the extreme type. He holds with Darwin that man has been evolved from the ape. In his search for arguments to prove his thesis, he has been for some years pursuing an idea to which he attaches much importance. If he could show from the actual prenatal life of man that the individual man is evolved from an embryo, which at an early stage of its growth cannot be distinguished from the embryos of certain other animals, the ape for instance, an actual case of evolution would be furnished, having an analogy with the evolution of the entire human species in the lapse of ages in the past. The reader will have perceived that so far as the argument could have any force at all, it would simply present an analogy between an actual case and a merely possible one. But even to effect thus much, the actual fact would have to be produced. Heckle was equal to the task. In a pamphlet published in 1907 and entitled Das Menschenproblem, he exhibited some drawings of embryo men and apes, supposed to be taken from nature. In these representations, men and apes were shown to be exactly alike, and doubtless Haeckel rubbed his hands with Barnum-like glee at the success of his little venture. This was the first act of the little drama. In the second came the denouement. In 1908, Dr. Arnold Brass, after a careful study of the diagrams, proved conclusively that many of them were inaccurate and worthless, and others purposely and deliberately falsified. This scientific world was soon in a ferment, and a war of words ensued. It was brought to a close in 1909 by Haeckel himself in the following statement, made in the Münchner Allgemeine Zeitung. To put an end to this unsavoury dispute, I begin at once with the contrite confession that a small number, 6 to 8%, of my embryo diagrams are really forgeries in Dr. Brass's sense. Those, namely, for which the observed material is so incomplete or insufficient as to compel us to fill in and reconstruct the missing links by hypothesis and comparative synthesis. I should feel utterly condemned and annihilated by this admission, were it not that hundreds of the best observers and most reputable biologists lie under the same charge. The great majority of all morphological, anatomical, histological, and embryonical diagrams are not true to nature, but are more or less doctored, schematized, and reconstructed. The controversy now entered a new phase. The scientific world had to defend itself against the sweeping charge under which Haeckel had sought shelter for his own poor head. Its defence was, to say the least, of a very dubious character. The following statement, signed by 46 professors representing 25 German and Austrian universities and scientific schools, was published in the Allgemeine Zeitung. The undersigned professors, directors of laboratories, etc., herewith declare that they do not approve of the method of schematizing which Haeckel has in some instances made use of. At the same time, in the interest of science and professional freedom, they condemn in the sharpest manner the warfare waged against Haeckel by Brass and the members of the Keplerbund. They declare, moreover, that the evolutionistic idea can suffer no detriment from some few inaccurately reproduced embryo diagrams. The evolutionistic idea suffers just as much as is involved in the loss of Haeckel's argument from analogy. Fraud has failed to bolster it up, and fraud was its only resource. Moreover, it should suffer considerable detriment from the last sentence of the document just quoted. The Keplerbund, a scientific society of the highest standing, felt itself bound to reply. A declaration was issued over the names of 25 scientists who were members of the Bund, and 11 who were not members. 19 learned institutions of Germany, Switzerland, and Austria were represented by the signatures. The declaration read in part as follows: "We are in agreement with the Keplerbund when it demands that henceforth, as in the past, German scientific research shall rest on an uncompromising love of truth and on the strictest personal sincerity." What should we say of a historian who should alter the letters of an inscription in order to put through a preconceived personal opinion? Haeckel's want of conscientiousness in popularizing scientific facts and philosophical speculations has been shown up by others besides Dr. Brass. We refer particularly to Wilhelm His, who in 1875 exposed the arbitrary manner in which Haeckel modified his scientific data. To declare as unimportant such arbitrary mutilations of the diagrams of other workers as Haeckel has been convicted of, by Ruttermeyer, His, and Brass, manifests a laxity of opinion to which we cannot assent. Haeckel is thus discredited by the signed verdict of 82 of the foremost German authorities, though to 46 of them it was evidently a sore task. And this is the man whose miserable travesty of science has been sapping the foundations of men's faith. And what a revelation does not the whole transaction make of what is going on in scientific circles in Germany, a country to which, for the rest, the world is so deeply indebted for its scientific knowledge. We may note, by the way, that Haeckel began his scientific frauds much earlier than the year 1907. In 1868, wishing to illustrate the identity and appearance of man, the dog, and the ape in their embryonic condition, he made 3 copies of one and the same drawing, and labelled them respectively man, dog, ape. Haeckel has noticed, and no doubt with keen regret, which he manages however to fob off with a smile, the large exodus from the ranks of the ultra-evolutionists occurring in the past few decades. But what will our readers think of a man who attributes the change of opinion that has taken place in the case of so many eminent scientists to the influence of age and increasing mental decrepitude? The diagnosis rebounds upon himself, and who fancies that the young and enthusiastic are more likely to lay hold of the truth than those who bring to their studies the ripe fruit of experience. Our readers can judge for themselves with what degree of success Haeckel has wielded the terrible piece of ordnance which is destined to make the Roman hierarchy tumble down like a house of cards. End of section 46. Recording by Florence. Section 47 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill. Section 47. Hell. Objection. God is good and merciful, but a good and merciful God would not condemn a soul to eternal torments. Therefore the eternity of hell is a contradiction of our belief in his goodness and mercy? The answer: God is good and merciful, but he is also just, and punishes sinners as they deserve to be punished, and a grievous offence against God deserves eternal punishment. God's loving kindness, on the other hand, is shown by the fact that he supplies, even superabundantly, the means of salvation, and by the fact that he bestows upon those who make a good use of those means a reward immeasurably greater than the absolute merit of those who receive it. Those who argue against eternal punishment or against God's mercy in connection with the eternity of punishment have the habit of fixing their gaze on one side of the picture and forgetting the other. The idea of eternal punishment so preoccupies their minds that they are well nigh incapable of thinking of the causes and circumstances of the punishment. And yet of all subjects, the punishment of the damned is the one that most requires to be considered in all its aspects, and that for the following reasons. 1. It is a matter concerning the Supreme Lord of heaven and earth, the infinite, eternal, and all-wise God. Of that Supreme Being we know, after all, so little that we should not turn the little knowledge we have of him into a weapon of offence against any of his attributes. 2. Of all the aspects of God's being known to man, that of his loving kindness and mercy is the one that is the most conspicuous in his dealings with mankind, and it is one that fills the human mind with inexpressible admiration. The abyss of his goodness and mercy is much more unfathomable than his motives for inflicting punishment. There is, it is true, a rigorous side to God's dealings with men, even during their mortal lives, that fills us with terror. But of that rigour we can, in some measure, divine the reasons. The pains and inflictions meted out both to individual men and to nations have often been the temporal punishment of crimes that have made the earth groan with the weight of the iniquities that have oppressed it, and the temporal punishment in many cases may have brought men to their senses and saved them from eternal punishment. Then, too, many of the temporal afflictions which men are all too prone to attribute to God as their source are not really attributable to him except in the sense that he has permitted them, that is to say, has not prevented them, but always for man's ultimate good. In cases in which a severe temporal punishment, only temporal and not eternal, so far as we have any means of knowing, has been given for what seemed a comparative trifle, as when Uzzah was rash enough to lay his hand upon the Ark of the Covenant, the punishment was intended to inspire the people with a sense of awe in dealing with sacred things. In the case of the chosen people, there was often need of a signal example of the divine displeasure following an act of irreverence, and the example often proves salutary for many a generation. Thus we can always find a reason for the severities of God's temporal rule, a reason that squares with our human sense of justice. But who will ever sound the depths of his loving kindness and mercy? Taking the divine bounties either singly or in their entire range, from creation to the beatific vision, who can ever say why or wherefore God should have conferred them at all? Why should he have created us when he had no need of us? For he was infinitely perfect, infinitely happy. Who will ever discover a reason except in his ineffably mysterious goodness? And creation is but the beginning of an endless train of blessings, temporal and eternal. His creating us to his image, and thereby endowing us with intelligence and free will, the natural and supernatural gifts lavished upon the first two of our race, the rich rewards of virtue he bestowed upon the patriarchs, upon Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, the care he bestowed upon the chosen people, in Egypt, in the desert, in the promised land, the abundant temporal rewards conferred upon the virtuous observers of the law. These are the unmerited and spontaneous outpourings of goodness which mark only one half of God's dealings with men. The other half must be sought in that new dispensation, which is the fulfillment of the types of the old. The prophecies had teemed with descriptions of a new era in which the favours of the Almighty would be showered down in untold abundance as the dowry which the Eternal Father was to send into the world with his divine Son. God so loved the world as to give his only begotten Son. Here we have a new abyss of mercy, which is more unfathomable than the first. The very life of the Saviour, apart from the innumerable blessings that came with him, would be sufficient of itself to prove that his mercies are the least comprehensible of all the things we know about God. But if we add to his life its superabundant merits, which when turned into graces form the inexhaustible treasury of God's Church, if we add the graces and consolations and the foretastes of heaven which is received with the sacraments which our divine Lord instituted, we shall obtain even then but a faint conception of the love of the Creator for the work of his hands. The climax is reached when the joys of heaven are added, joy springing from the possession of the infinite God himself, and for eternity. Is it not true, then, that the abyss of his mercies is more unfathomable than his motives for inflicting pain? If, therefore, a God whose mercies are unspeakably great visits some of his rational creatures with eternal punishment, there must be motives for punishing which are worthy of his infinite attributes. The thought of hell necessarily awakens deep reflection. Let not such reflection issue in an impeachment of the divine mercy. Let it rather issue in a deeper sense of the enormity of sin, of the ingratitude of the sinner, and of the perversity of one who not only adds sin upon sin, but sets at naught the divine warnings heard in the depths of his soul. Let it also open to view that unseen world of grace in which God fairly besieges the soul with his merciful inspirations. We know not the number of the reprobate, nor can we presume to pass judgment on any sinner who has left this world, no matter how great his sin. But one thing we know, that no one was ever lost who was not lost, in spite of God's merciful designs in his behalf. End of section 47. Recording by Florence.
Section 48 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Michael Migliaccio. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill. Section 48. The human race, how old is it? A modern objection. In the mud of the Mississippi, skeletons have been found that must have been there at least 60,000 years. Hence, the Bible's reckoning of 4,000 years from Adam to Christ is discredited by physical science. The answer: it is anything but certain that the Bible reckons 4,000 years between Adam and Christ. There are varying texts and different versions of the sacred writings. If the genealogies given in the Latin Vulgate are to be regarded as determining the age of the human race, the successive generations of men do indeed make up a total of some 4,000 years, but according to the Greek Septuagint, more than 1,000 more must be reckoned. And yet both versions are in use in the Church. Ecclesiastical authority leaves it undecided which of the two accounts is the correct one, or whether both are not wrong, and a third, that of the original text, right. But a more important point still to be noted by students and readers of the sacred books is that even if the Vulgate, or the Septuagint, as the case might be, should be proved to be in all respects authentic and substantially trustworthy, the Bible need not necessarily be regarded as determining the age of the human race. Catholic biblical scholars whose orthodoxy cannot be questioned admit this view and support it, with solid arguments. True, the names and ages of successive patriarchs are given in the Bible, and a plain reader of the text might consider it a simple problem in arithmetic to figure out the total age of the human race from Adam to Christ. But as scholars view it, the problem may be a more intricate one, not only because we have no certainty of the number of years in the original text of pre-Mosaic genealogies, but also because there are grave reasons for thinking that there may be gaps in the genealogies of the Bible, not, however, of a kind to detract from the Bible's inerrancy. The reasons in detail the reader will find in the articles in the Catholic Encyclopedia entitled Chronology Biblical and Genealogy in the Bible. Our only concern here is to state that there is nothing either in Catholic scholarship or in the pronouncements of the Church authority obliging us to hold that the Bible fixes the age of the human race as 4,000 or 5,000 or indeed any definite number of years. If neither scholarship nor authority can read an exact and complete chronology into the Bible, much less can the average skeptic, who lightly, and for the most part ignorantly, appeals to the results of scientific research. Apart from what we know from the Bible, the insignificance of our knowledge of primate man is indicated by the meager collection of prehistoric human remains preserved in our great museums. There is indeed an immense collection of implements, such as tools and weapons of flint, and a certain number of carvings and drawings, all of which give evidence of the manual skill and the mental capacity of the men belonging to the Stone Age, a period deriving its name from the use of stone implements before the use of metals was known. But the search for human remains, such as skulls, jawbones, or thigh bones, and especially for whole skeletons, has been much less fruitful. The following is almost a complete list of really important finds of prehistoric human relics: a human skull found in the Neanderthal Valley near Düsseldorf, and a few others of the same peculiar type. An underjaw found at Nollet in Belgium, a skeleton discovered at Cannstatt, Germany, a jawbone found in the Schipka cave in Moravia, the complete skeletons of a woman found at Spy in Belgium, a skeleton found at Olmo in Tuscany, a skull discovered at Igishima in Alsace, a skeleton found at Galley Hill in Kent, a jawbone found in a sandpit at Mau near Heidelberg, a jawbone and fragments of a cranium discovered at Piltdown in Sussex. These remains are in some cases the merest fragments of human skeletons, and much difficulty has been experienced in the task of reconstruction, that is to say, in the attempt to present an idea of the whole from indications supplied by the parts. In the case of the Piltdown remains, it is doubtful whether the jawbone and the imperfect cranium belong to the same individual, and whether they are both human. What is the value of these human remains? They would possess a considerable value to the student of prehistoric man if they bore any indication of their age, but their age is a matter of conjecture. Supposing they belong to the Stone Age, do they belong to the earlier periods of that epoch, or to the later? As regards the Neanderthal skull, Professor Virchow, whose authority will not be questioned, assures us that there is no proof that it dates from the early Stone Age, but admits that it may possibly belong to the later Stone Age. Its age is undetermined, he says, and it may be of a much later date. Quoted by Rank, Der Mensch 2, page 484. So speak the really great men of science about the significance of these remains, generally, as bearing on the age of the human race. They simply do not know at what interval the present generation stands from the time when these human relics were deposited in the places where they were found. They can guess, they can hazard calculations in which a number of ifs must be understood, but this is not exact science, and it should never be quoted as such against the Bible. The reader can form an idea of the present state of science in this connection when he is told that the estimates of the age of the race vary from 10,000 years, perhaps much too low a figure, to 10 million. The estimates that mount highest are generally those of evolutionists, who assume without a particle of proof that man was gradually evolved from the ape, and that the evolution required an enormous lapse of time. But evolutionary theory is one thing, well-authenticated fact quite another. But our opponents have another stone in their wallet. They appeal to the astronomical tables of the East Indians, but happily modern astronomy enables us to lay the objection to rest. The eminent astronomer Littrow is surely entitled to be heard on the subject. He says, "The astronomical tables of the Indians, to which they themselves attribute so high an antiquity, show clearly that they were drawn up at a time when the motion of Saturn was slowest and that of Jupiter fastest. And this circumstance enables us to determine with some certainty the time at which these tables were composed. If the eccentricities which they assign to several of the planetary orbits be combined, it becomes very probable, as Laplace has shown, that the tables, so far from having been composed 4,000 years before the beginning of our reckoning, really date from a period as late as the beginning of the 16th century after Christ, and were made after the model of European tables. Wonder des Himmels, page 831. Science has really nothing to say against the comparatively recent origin of man, and the Bible is in possession of the field. See Apes and Men and Evolution. End of section 48.
Section 49 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Tony Duchepek. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill. Indifferentism. The plea of the indifferentist. Religious creeds are a matter of personal preference, and a search for the right creed, if there is any such thing, cannot be expected of the average man. On the other hand, we all have a grasp of certain principles of morality which are the mainstay of society. With these, society may well rest contented. Our answer. We have dealt in another article with the watchword of the indifferentist, deeds not creeds, and have endeavored to show its absurdity. In the present article, we aim at being more helpful to the indifferentist by enabling him, if possible, to realize the gravity of the situation in which he finds himself, and by furnishing him with a positive clue to the discovery of the truth. The indifferentist believes, or tries to make himself believe, that the motto "deeds, not creeds" is the embodiment of common sense. Let us sift it a little. Ask a man of this way of thinking what deeds he means. Ask him to draw up a list of those deeds, which he thus sets over against the creeds, that is to say, of the acts and habits which he deems morally right. Ask a second and a third, and so on indefinitely, to do the same. You will find that no two such lists will in all points tally, and some will be much longer than others. One man's list of honest deeds will include no more than honesty, sobriety, obedience to the laws when they cannot be evaded, and the care of one's family, with perhaps a bit of philanthropy and public spirit thrown in by way of giving a sort of halo to the rest. These are only the deeds and duties without which even pagan society could not get on at all, and without which the individual would come to grief. Another vaunter of deeds as against creeds would add a few more virtues to his list. His moral sense is of a finer sort, and hence he adds to the catalogue meekness and patience, charity in words, mere thoughts would be under no moral restraint, and chastity, as a matter of outward behavior. Another would add sincerity, an approach to humility, and a restraint upon thoughts and desires. One would like to know, in dealing with such persons, where the line is to be drawn between the good and bad deeds. Why should one man's list of virtues be longer than another's? Have they any criterion by which to discover whether any one of them is complete and exhaustive? And then, what is the criterion for deciding whether any deed deserves to be called virtuous? Most men who are indifferent to positive creeds are quite at sea on these points. As to prayer and worship, well, they may have some vague notion of the fitness and reasonableness of the thing, but they would seldom think of entering it on the list of moral duties. And then the very notion of duty and obligation, which underlies all their ideas about virtue and vice, upon what is it based? The basis is either a rational or an irrational one. If it is a rational one, it will resolve itself into a judgment that certain things are right and ought to be done, whilst other things are wrong and ought to be avoided. In other words, into a dictate of conscience. But conscience must be based upon a belief, implied at least, that there is some higher power than our own wills, one to which our wills are subject. For there can be no duty or obligation unless it be imposed by a will which has a sovereign right over ours, the will of a personal deity. Any other basis for the notion of duty is irrational. You may see the expediency or the utility of doing certain things which you consider right, but that it is a duty for you to do them, that you must do them, you would regard as absurd unless you admitted to a higher will to which yours was subject. The existence of this sovereign power is frequently a matter of doubt or even of denial to the one who is a vaunter of deeds and a contemner of creeds. Formally or virtually, he is an atheist or an agnostic. What or how much do you believe? We would ask the indifferentist concerning the existence of a God who has brought you into being and has a claim on your obedience. And what bearing do you suppose obedience to God has upon one's eternal destiny? You have drawn up a brief list of essential duties. What if obedience to God requires you to extend the list? Whatever be the present state of your mind regarding that subject, the question is one of tremendous importance to you personally. Your eternal destiny must far outweigh any possible amount of difficulty involved in a search for light on the subject. If the duty of knowing and serving God were but a fancy engendered in weak and ignorant minds, it might be set aside as undeserving of attention. But if the brightest and noblest minds in history have accepted it and acted upon it, it surely possesses a special claim to your attention. Even though it had no such high recommendation, the fact that eternity is at stake should be enough to induce you to make an honest inquiry after the truth. Such an inquiry need not be a hopeless one. It is not a matter of traveling into some unknown region of speculation in which there are no landmarks for the guidance of the traveler. These 1900 years a power has been at work in this world which has wrought for the ennobling, elevating, and purifying of the human soul, and which bears upon it the seal of its divine origin. Impeded in its action at times by the human instrument which it must employ, nevertheless by reason of the divine element in it, it has won its way to human hearts and has gradually embraced the greater part of the world within the sphere of its influence. Christianity is the first subject to be studied by anyone who is setting about a search for the truth, the more so as Christianity has sprung from and is the perfecting of the oldest, the most consistent, the noblest tradition of religious teaching in the history of the world, that of the chosen people of God. Toglie et lege. Take up the book of the Gospels, as the angel said to St. Augustine, whose giant intellect was for a time held captive by one of the false philosophies of his day. Read with the unbiased mind of an Augustine, and pray with but 1/10 of his fervor, and sooner or later light will succeed darkness. We have been thinking in the above passage of the type of indifferentist who makes light of all religious knowledge, who knows nothing and cares to know nothing about God, revelation, or immortality. But there is one of another type who is something of a Christian and who respects the authority of Christ and the Bible. Bred in childhood to the teaching of one or other of the Christian sects, he has allowed the cares or the pleasures of the world to draw him away from religious worship, or it may be he attends religious services intermittently, though he brings to them a set of Christian or half-Christian beliefs of his own making. In either case, when the claims of the one true religion are urged, he takes refuge behind a sort of half-conviction that after all it matters little which of the creeds he adopts, provided his deeds are in harmony with the Christian code, whatever that may mean to him. An indifferentist of this class should be reminded that the first and foremost of those good deeds of which he makes so much account is to believe, and believe in its totality what Christ has revealed, and what he has enjoined upon all to believe. That revelation is one and unchangeable, and constitutes a definite body of teachings placed in the keeping of a church, one only church, which is the pillar and ground of truth, against which the gates of hell shall not prevail. To his teachers the promise was given, Behold, I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. That this definite teaching of a visible church must be accepted by all is plain from the words of Christ. Go ye into the whole world, and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. Or as the Protestant Authorized Version has it, shall be damned. If a rejection of Christ's teaching deserves eternal damnation, an indifference to all creeds must deserve the same penalty. Therefore, an effort to find the one true creed is an imperative duty. But, replies the indifferentist, as things are today, how is it possible to discover the true faith of Christ? Must I examine the claims of 700 sects, each asserting its own exclusive possession of the truth? The difficulty you fear is in the first place exaggerated. Yet even if it were much greater than it is, the importance of the object of your quest would far outweigh the difficulty involved in searching for it. It is a matter of obtaining the pearl of great price and of providing for eternity. If you were given 700 keys of all shapes, and were told that one of them, by a certain number of turns to the right and left, would unlock the door of an apartment containing untold treasures, all of which would be yours if you lighted on the right key and discovered how to use it, would you not spend whole days, nay even months and years, searching for the right key and applying it to the lock? Most men would, and not unreasonably, for the treasure would be worth the trouble. But the search for the truth is not so intricate a nature. It is true that but one of the 700 keys is the right one. But there are ways of simplifying the search. There are tests that may be applied, by means of which you may in a short time eliminate all but the right key. By the use of these tests, countless inquirers have, as a matter of fact, been led to the truth. Some have applied to the various Christian sects the historical test or that of origin. The church that could trace its history back to the apostles must have superior claims to those churches that have existed only a few centuries, and which were repudiated and cut off from communion by the church, which has undoubtedly existed since the time of the apostles. Others have applied the test of universality. The Church of Christ must be a world church. It must be confined to no single country or race, and above all, must not derive all its authority from the secular government of any particular country. But there is one test which is perhaps the most obvious and the most easily applied: the test of unity, and to this we would ask the special attention of the indifferentist. It needs but little reflection to see that unity should be one of the chief attributes of the Church to which Christ committed the preaching of the Word. In the first place, the doctrine he commanded it to preach was to be one and unchanged forever. This, from the nature of the case, should be obvious. No one, not even an angel from heaven, St. Paul admonishes us, was authorized to change it. It is no less clear that perfect agreement should subsist among those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. Otherwise, it would have been useless for one only doctrine to have been preached to all. Moreover, oneness of doctrine was to be rooted in oneness of authority, the divinely constituted teaching authority of the Church. Our Lord did not simply exhort his followers to unity of doctrine, but gave them a body of accredited teachers who were to go forth, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. He that believeth you and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. He that heareth you heareth me. He that despiseth you despiseth me. If he will not hear the church, let him be to thee as the heathen and the publican. Such is the visible teaching authority established by Christ. This and no other can be the source of all right doctrine, and consequently of all unity of doctrine in the Church. In any church professing to be Christian and yet not teaching with authority, unity of doctrine is left to chance, or rather is exposed to certain disruption. The Jews said of our Lord that he spoke as one having authority, and not as the scribes and the Pharisees. And a consciousness of divine authority showed itself in every word he uttered. The same note of authority rang through the discourse of St. Peter on the day of Pentecost. No less authoritative were the utterances of the Apostle of the Gentiles. And if there is a church today that perpetuates the mission of Christ and his apostles, its teaching must bear the same stamp of authority. Oneness of doctrine and oneness of authority are therefore a characteristic note of the true Church of Christ. Take unity as your criterion, we would say to the indifferentist, and you will find that the problem of finding the one Church of Christ is rendered comparatively easy. Your 700 religions will at once resolve themselves into two classes: those that possess unity and those that do not. In the first class, you will find the Catholic Church and no other. Catholic and Roman Catholic are the same. The unity of the Catholic Church is so conspicuous as to force itself on the notice and excite the jealousy of its enemies. Every single Catholic in a grand total of nearly 300 million believes the same doctrine as every other member of the Church. True, in matters that have not been defined as of faith, considerable latitude is permitted to personal opinion, and on these points there has been divergence of opinion. But on the other hand, there is a tribunal which is competent to decide, in the first place, what is of faith and what is not, and in the second place, which of the parties to a controversy is in the right. The unity of the Church consists then in the universal acceptance of what is taught as of faith, and the readiness to accept the decision of the Church in matters of controversy. With human minds constituted as they are, this is the most perfect unity conceivable, and indeed, there is no parallel to it in human society. Outside the Catholic Church, we find enormous number of sects all bearing the name of Christian. Taken as a body, and to a great extent taken singly, these Christian sects are confessedly and notoriously disunited. Their one common ground is their opposition to the only church that possesses unity. Even the Bible, which has always been the one rule of faith, has fallen from its once high place in their estimation and is gradually sinking to the rank of an ordinary history containing a large admixture of the mythical. All the world knows that many of the leading lights of Protestantism deal with the Bible in a purely rationalistic spirit. But even when the Bible ruled supreme, it was the very fountain source of disunion, for it was on the alleged authority of the Bible that every new dissenting sect based its separation from the older ones. This tendency to disunion has been the most striking trait of Protestantism from the beginning. Not even the potent influence of such characters as Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli could reduce their followers to unity. Seeing, however, that their teachings must be backed by an assertion of authority, they ruled the conduct and consciences of their subjects with a rod of iron. But private judgment was not to be stifled. Who is this Luther? Who Calvin? Who Zwingli? Are we not as good interpreters of the Bible as they? So queried their followers, and hence the numerous divisions that sprang up even during the infancy of Protestantism. It is of great importance, wrote Calvin to Melanchthon, that the divisions that subsist among us should not be known to future ages. For nothing can be more ridiculous than that we, who have been compelled to make a separation from the whole world, should have agreed so ill among ourselves from the beginning of the Reformation. Mellington wrote in answer that the Elbe, with all its waters, could not furnish tears enough to weep over the miseries of the distracted Reformation. Beza makes moan in a similar strain. Our people, he says, are carried away by every wind of doctrine. If you know what their religion is today, you cannot tell what it may be tomorrow. There is not a single point which is not held by some of them as an article of faith, and by others rejected as an impiety. Each individual is a free and fully authorized judge of all those who wish to instruct him, and each one is taught by God alone. The divisions of Protestantism have not been healed by time. It is no paradox to say that disintegration is the law of its being. Temporary union is the result of the accidents of time and place. Where everyone may think as he pleases, there may be as many religions as there are heads to invent them. We have endeavored to furnish the indifferentist a clue that may lead him out of the labyrinth into which he has been driven by the sight of the multitudinous sects whose claims are so confused and so confusing. The clue we offer him is neither new nor untried, for it has been used by many in the same situation. Moreover, testimony of the strongest kind has been rendered in its favor by a class of thinkers who, though not embracing the truth themselves, have lost nothing of their logical acumen. It is a well-known position of many unbelievers of the skeptical and critical schools that if Christianity were true, there would be no choice for them between Roman Catholicism and any other form of Christianity. Unity and consistency are naturally looked for by logical minds in the teaching of a God-man and his true representatives. The strength of this testimony lies in the fact of its coming from so independent a source. For anyone who is convinced by the above reasoning, there is but one practical course open. He should seek instruction in Catholic doctrine. End of section 49, Indifferentism. Recording by Tony Duchepek.
Section 50 of the Catholic's Ready Answer. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla, Columbus, Ohio. The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill. Indulgences. Erroneous views. 1. Indulgences are an easy means of obtaining pardon for sin, even future sin, without repentance. They have been applied to the releasing of souls from purgatory, and for that purpose they might be bought for money. 2. In theory, indulgences always presupposed repentance, but as the business was managed in Germany before the Reformation, it amounted in the popular apprehension to a sale of absolution from guilt, or to the ransom of deceased friends from purgatory for money. Fisher, Outlines of Universal History, page 397. The truth. An indulgence is neither a pardon for sin nor a license to commit sin. It supposes repentance for sin. In this matter, the practical belief of Catholics has never been at variance with the theory as set forth by Catholic theologians. Old prejudices die hard, especially in matters religious, but the collapse of the old prejudice against indulgences has already begun. The two sets of objections placed at the head of this article, which are not in entire agreement, are intended to exhibit the turn of the tide of popular opinion regarding indulgences. Our opponents are gradually getting nearer the truth. The author of a popular textbook informs us that indulgences are not, in theory, a pardon for sin, but that the people of Germany once thought they were and bought them as such. Let us hope that the editor of some future edition of the book will advance a step further and tell his readers that indulgences neither are nor have thought to be anything but remission of temporal punishment after repentance. What is meant by an indulgence? An indulgence is the remission or canceling of the temporal punishment due to sin after the sin itself has been forgiven. The punishment is to be suffered either in this life or the next. In this life, it may take the form either of voluntary penance or of penance enjoined by the Church. It supposes sincere repentance for sin, and in many cases is given only on condition of contrite confession. Such is the technical and ecclesiastical meaning of the word indulgence. It differs somewhat from its ordinary meaning. In common parlance, it means an easy, yielding, and forbearing disposition toward those who are subject to us, and does not necessarily imply repentance or atonement for offenses committed. In ecclesiastical usage, it signifies a favor granted to those who are already friends of God by the possession of sanctifying grace. A soul stained by grievous sin must first be reconciled with God before receiving any such favors at the hands of the Church. The definition we have given implies that even when God forgives sin, there may still be some atonement to be made for it. The idea is not a familiar one to persons outside the Catholic Church, but it is nonetheless scriptural. Moses, though a friend of God and forgiven his transgression, was nevertheless punished by not being permitted to enter the Promised Land. David was pardoned by the Lord for his double crime of adultery and murder. The Lord also hath taken away thy sin, the prophet Nathan told him. Nevertheless, he added, because thou hast given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, for this thing the child that is born to thee shall surely die. A plain case of punishment inflicted after the forgiveness of the sin. Now it is precisely the canceling of such punishment that is meant by an indulgence. But is it possible that the Church has it in her power to release the sinner from such atonement for his sin? Such power has undoubtedly been conferred upon the Church. The idea of a Church that wields the power of the keys has unfortunately faded away from the minds of our separated brethren, and yet it stands out in strong relief upon the pages of Scripture. Whatsoever thou shalt loose upon the earth, it shall be loosed in heaven. Matthew chapter 16, verse 19. These words were addressed to Peter, but the same powers were afterward conferred on all the apostles. Matthew chapter 18, verse 18. By reason of their generality, we must understand these words to refer to every bond or obstacle which bars heaven against the faithful, consequently to the outstanding temporal punishment of sin. Even greater power than this was given the apostles. Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them. John chapter 20, verse 23. What wonder, then, if possessing a power that can open or close the gates of heaven to sinners for all eternity, they should possess the lesser power of retaining or remitting the mere temporal punishment due to sin? Objection. The remission of such temporal punishment by indulgences should be a comparatively rare occurrence and should not be granted on such easy terms as they are in the Church in Rome. Punishment becomes a byword when it is frequently cancelled on merciful considerations. Answer. Indulgences are frequently given, it is true, but not on such easy terms as fancied. Some of the smaller indulgences are granted for the recitation of short prayers, but the greater the indulgence, the greater the exaction. In all cases, good works of one kind or another are enjoined, such as fasting, almsgiving, confession, communion, visits to churches, pilgrimages, and the like. But even supposing that all indulgences were granted on the easiest possible conditions, it must be remembered that, though punishment is demanded by justice and may be salutary to the penitent, nevertheless there may be something better than a punishment. A prudent parent will easily cancel a child's punishment when such indulgence will lead to the child's improvement. Now there is one thing the Church never loses sight of in granting indulgences: the spiritual good of those who receive them. As a matter of fact, the discipline of indulgences produces a great increase of piety among the faithful. The good works required bring the sinner nearer to God. Prayer, confession of sins, the receiving of the bread of life, anticipate the salutary effects of punishment and render the soul more pleasing to God. The power conferred on the apostles, and consequently on their successors, was exercised by them from the beginning of the history of the Church. Witness St. Paul's treatment of the incestuous Corinthian, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 3-5, and 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. In the name and by the power of Jesus Christ he punishes the sinner, but afterward, as repenting the person of Christ, he remits the punishment. The binding and the loosing were evidently regarded by St. Paul as ratified in heaven. In the early days of the Church, it was customary to impose severe public penances for the more grievous offenses. These canonical penances might last for years. They were intended partly as an expiation for sins committed, and on account of their being imposed by the binding powers of the Church, they were regarded as though imposed by God himself. And when the Church exercised her power of loosing by remitting a portion of the punishment, or, in other words, granted an indulgence, the punishment was believed to have been cancelled by God himself. The power of binding and loosing given by God would be recognized by him in its actual exercise. In times of persecution, those who were imprisoned for the faith, especially those who were about to suffer martyrdom, could obtain for well-disposed penitents a shortening of their terms of canonical penance. St. Cyprian bears express testimony to the belief that such favors bestowed by the Church were ratified by God. In one of his epistles, he expresses confidence in the belief that sinners who are on their deathbeds and have not had time to complete their canonical penances are helped before God and will come to him in peace, in consequence of the indulgences of the Church granted at the solicitation of the martyrs. The These writings generally, of St. Cyprian, Tertullian, and many other authorities of the first 5 centuries, throw a clear light upon the belief and practice of the early church in the matter of indulgences. Both the belief and the practice were the same then as they are today. As to the application of indulgences to the souls in purgatory, it must be noted that the Church lays no claim to jurisdiction over the souls in the other life. Hence, if indulgences are applied to the souls of the dead, it is only per modum suffragii, i.e. by way of petition. The Church presents her offering or ransom to the Almighty, and it is doubtless accepted, though we cannot know with certainty how much any particular soul is benefited by it. And now a word or two about the abuses, real and imaginary, in the actual administration of indulgences, out of which the adversaries of the Catholic faith have made so much capital, especially the alleged traffic in indulgences which roused Luther's ire and was the immediate occasion of his onslaught upon the Church. In the first place, there is nothing too sacred to be free from abuse, but the abuse of a good thing furnishes no argument against its proper use. Just before Luther's revolt, there were undoubtedly some abuses connected with the preaching of a notable indulgence published by Pope Leo X, but they were committed contrary to the explicit instructions of ecclesiastical superiors, and they were condemned in that day, as they are condemned today, by all right-minded Catholics. But, granting that there were certain extravagances attending the preaching of this indulgence, we must deny that they were such as to justify the sweeping assertions placed at the head of this article, and yet these are typical of the attacks made upon Catholic doctrine and practice. Recent historians have thrown some light upon the facts of the case. In the year 1514, Pope Leo X published an indulgence to aid in the completing of St. Peter's Church in Rome. It was to be gained partly by the performance of some of the usual good works, confession, communion, and a fast, but the well-to-do were to add an alms for completion of the church, while the poor, instead of giving an alms, were to say extra prayers. The indulgence obtained under the grant might be applied, or transferred, to the souls in purgatory. There is nothing absurd or unchristian in supposing that God deigns to have regard to good works, including almsgiving, performed for the benefit of souls in the other life, only we cannot know, as we have said, whether or how much any particular soul is benefited by such acts. Nevertheless, there was at that time an opinion held by some theologians that a plenary indulgence applied to a particular soul was certain to release it from the fires of purgatory. It is easy to imagine how a doctrine like this might be exploited by a zealous preacher whose heart was set upon large money returns. That it was so exploited, at least by some and to a certain extent, we must frankly admit as a historical fact, though we are not bound to accept the traditional Protestant account of the matter, which is inspired by prejudice against the Church. For well nigh 4 centuries, Protestants have made merry over real or imaginary extravagances in the preaching of indulgences in the 16th century. Why, in the name of justice, why this constant taunting of us Catholics for such religious abuses of the Middle Ages? Why the constant endeavor to shame us and our Catholic ancestors? Were they not equally the ancestors of our Protestant antagonists? And do not we as well as our separated brethren condemn these abuses? The real difference between our Protestant friends and ourselves is that we have discarded the abuses but clung to the old faith, while they have rejected all in the lump. The fact of primary importance is that no abuse connected with indulgences in the 16th century, or indeed any century, ever met with the approval of the Church, and that every such abuse was visited with express condemnation. The utterances of Cardinal Cajetan, says Jansen, prove that the sentiments of the preachers in question were not those of Rome. The preachers, says Cajetan, came forward in the name of the Church in so far as they proclaim the teaching of Christ and the Church. But if they teach out of their own heads and for their own profit, things about which they have no knowledge, they cannot pass as representatives of the Church, and one cannot wonder that in such cases they fall into error. And yet it was such accidental abuses, which never had the Church's approval, that furnished a pretext for the unspeakable scandal of a revolt against the Church itself by the founder of Protestantism. Efforts to correct the abuses in question had been made before Luther's time. The Church ultimately succeeded, as only the true Church can succeed, in ridding itself of any such ugly excrescence. The Catholic Church is indeed the only religious body possessing the power of correcting abuses within its pale without disrupting itself. It is not true, then, that indulgences are an easy mean of obtaining pardon for sin. They have nothing to do with the guilt of sin, and the remission of temporal punishment due to sin cannot be obtained except by the contrite of heart. As to the statement that at least in the popular estimation indulgences were a sale of absolution from guilt, such assertions are easily made, but where is the proof? When was there a time in the history of the Church when the essential conditions for obtaining specific indulgences were not clearly set forth in official documents addressed to the multitude? These conditions always included interior dispositions, especially sorrow for sin. As to the alleged popular persuasion that particular souls in purgatory could be ransomed by money, Is the possible effect upon the ignorant of indiscreet preaching by a certain class of preachers on a certain occasion to be erected into evidence of a general popular perversion of belief? End of section 50. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla, Columbus, Ohio.